Safe by Hampshire Police. We'll have the latest on that case. That's what we're talking about for the next hour, but what do you need to vent? Email me, gbnews@gbnews.uk. Or of course, you can tweet me at GBNews. And there's a poll up right now asking, is it right to make abuse of women a hate crime? Firstly, though, it's time for the news headlines.
Good afternoon, it is 2:01. I'm Rosie Wright to get you up to date here on GB News. Boris Johnson has denied lying to Parliament, insisting he believed a gathering in Number 10's garden during lockdown was a work event. His former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, though, says he's prepared to swear under oath that the Prime Minister lied to MPs when he said he didn't know beforehand about the garden party in May 2020. Well, during a visit to a North London hospital, the Prime Minister said he regrets the drinks event in Number 10.
I want to begin by repeating my apologies to everybody for the misjudgments that I've made, that we may have made in Number 10 and beyond, whether in Downing Street or throughout the pandemic. I tell you categorically that nobody told me and nobody said that this was something that was against the rules, that was a breach of the COVID rules, or we were doing something that wasn't a work event.
A British gunman who took 4 hostages at a Texas synagogue was previously investigated by MI5. Malik Faisal Akram from Blackburn in Lancashire was investigated in 2020 and was assessed to no longer be a threat at the time he travelled to the United States. He was shot and killed after a 10-hour standoff with police and SWAT officers. No one else was injured. Huge crowds have gathered for the funeral of the primary school teacher Aisling Murphy in County Offaly in Ireland. Her pupils lined the streets holding instruments and photographs of their primary school teacher. The Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin and the President Michael D. Higgins were both in attendance. The 23-year-old was killed while running along the Grand Canal in Tullamore. Magistrates will be given more sentencing powers in an attempt to reduce the backlog of criminal cases that built up during the pandemic. Magistrates will now be able to sentence more serious cases that would previously have gone to the Crown Court, such as fraud, theft and assault. They'll also be able to give jail terms now of up to a year, which is double the current maximum of 6 months. Some critics, though, have called it a sticking plaster solution. The House of Lords has voted against government plans to clamp down on noisy protests. Crossbench peer Lord Coville tabled an amendment to the new crime bill, arguing the original bill could prohibit large, peaceful and well-organised demonstrations from taking place. Well, the amendment would ensure that, for example, there isn't a ban on loud protests in Parliament Square. Baroness Claire Fox told GB News the right to protest is legal and laws should not infringe upon that.
The government asked the Lords to start deciding law by bringing them in, trying to sneak them in through the Lords in November. You basically got ministers standing up saying, well, we will allow you to do that if you behave. And you do think, I'm sorry, it's our right to protest that's legal. You have to now justify when you make it illegal. And they didn't justify it. That's the reality. And they, as a consequence, were humiliated.
The Prime Minister has warned President Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to rewrite the rules over Ukraine amid continued tensions. Well, Britain is supplying further self-defence weapons to Ukraine over concerns about a possible Russian invasion. The UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says a small number of personnel will also provide training to Ukrainian forces, but stressed British troops would not be deployed to fight Russians. Russia has amassed 100,000 soldiers, as well as tanks, rocket artillery and short-range ballistic missiles at their border with Ukraine. The number of employees on payroll grew in December, but average pay fell in November for the first time in more than a year. The Office for National Statistics says the number of UK employees rose by 0.6% in December to nearly 30 million people. Figures also reveal that in the 3 months up to November, the unemployment rate fell back to almost where it was pre-pandemic. Now, British #1 star Emma Raducanu has won her first-round Australian Open match in 3 sets. The 19-year-old tennis star beat America's Sloane Stephens and fought back from losing the second set 6-2 to win the third set. You are up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's go to Alex and We Need to Talk About.
It sometimes feels to me that women are being swept away in a dangerous torrent. The dizzying pace of social change with unrestricted male-centric sexual freedoms, multiculturalism importing medieval oppressions, and the traditional family unit under attack. Not to mention the pressures of objectification and social media and porn, a looming mental health crisis among teenage girls, our safe spaces under threat from an implacable trans lobby, violent attacks against women appearing in the pages of every day. As more and more rights pile up for others, it often feels like women's rights must pay the price. And so, when it was announced that misogyny could be made a hate crime, I thought, at last, a seminal moment where we can ring-fence and defend the vital protections we so need as the speeding waters threaten to plunge our hard-won progress into oblivion. But the more I read, the more I started to think the proposal was a red herring, a flimsy branch that, if grabbed, would inevitably snap, and in doing so, seal, wash the utter failure of our legal system when it comes to prosecutions for crimes against women, like rape and domestic violence. Does it, including people who identify as women, engage a threat to our rights straight to the heart of the actions? Today, we really need to talk about misogyny as a hate crime. We wanted to see proponents of misogyny as a hate crime, including Baroness Newlove and the MP Stella Creasy, as well as organisations that have backed the move, but no one was available. So this is the perfect opportunity to introduce you properly to today's special guest, Jean Hatchett, who's a women's rights activist and writer who every year raises thousands of pounds for charity by riding for women murdered by the men they knew. Jean, what's your take on this, misogyny as a hate crime? Are you concerned that it's gone through the Lords and that this could well become law in the UK? Or do you think, well, it's about time that someone's identified that women need to be protected? Because there are crimes that especially target women.
I mean, you would think that as a feminist, you think, yeah, this is going to be a really reasonable proposition, but it very quickly became clear that this isn't the solve-all that it proposes to be. And I think the reason that you can't get someone to defend this today and to sort of speak on why this amendment's been proposed is because they know right at the centre of this is exactly what you've said, is this issue of sex and gender, which of course are very, very different things. And sex is removed from that hate crime bill. But, if you've simultaneously got a rape rate of a conviction rate of less than 1% now, it's effectively decriminalised, then, clearly there's something really wrong with the criminal justice system itself. And so just saying, misogyny is a hate crime now, it means absolutely nothing to improving, ways of tackling violence against women. We need to look at appropriate sentencing, and simply hanging hate crime on these dreadful assaults on women's rights is going to do virtually nothing at all. And I think, some of the misogyny that we're talking about is actually intrinsic to the system now. So we've got bench rules where a woman who's been raped may have to call her rapist in court her and talk about her penis and where it went. And this is just absolutely, this is misogyny on steroids, right through the criminal justice system. And this is happening, well, it seems to feminist women like this is on a daily basis, which creep and creep and creep until, what are we talking about when we're talking about women? We don't know anymore because, as we can see with this particular amendment, it includes people who say they're women. And, I don't agree with that.
Do you think that from the beginning it felt a bit like a trinket? You know, it felt a bit like a branding exercise rather than something really well thought through? Because I must admit, when I first started listening to the arguments for it, I was captivated. I thought, well, this is so necessary because I felt this constant encroachment on the protections of women that, you know, have stood fast for about a century, let's say, just constantly being eroded away, whether it's the debate about minority cultures and some of the imported attitudes towards women that we now have in this country, whether it's about the trans lobby and men simply saying they're women, accessing women's space, whether it's about the ongoing objectification, pornification of women, the mental health crises happening amongst teenage girls. I thought at least this puts a line in the sand and is once again discussing women as sufferers of very particular forms of societal abuse, personal abuse. But it doesn't actually seem to tackle those things. And if anything, it seems to me that it offers a get-out-of-jail-free card for the government to continue to ignore the pressures of the internet, particularly on young women, and continue to sort of do a box-ticking exercise when it comes to rape convictions. I mean, what can we do now? We can see that things are evidently getting worse for young women. What can we do to protect them?
I mean, we were going to talk about the manifesto later and some of the things that, you know, I'd quite like to see happen. But regarding this, what women are faced with now is the accusations that we're excluding people. And, you know, this will allow a protected group who are transgender people already protected within the hate crime legislation of the country. And they will be protected again, but they'll be included in the hate crime statistics for women. And so, once again, we will hear this phrase, the most vulnerable women in society are trans women. And actually, we know that the overwhelming victims of men's murder of women are actual women. So I'm really concerned that, you know, this crime of misgendering and, you know, hurting someone's feelings is going to measure up against someone going out for a run and being murdered, and that's really not the same thing at all. So I think, you know, we have to really be very clear here that men are committing acts of extreme violence against female people. And I think that's all been very nicely blurred by the proposers of this amendment. And I think, you know, if you simultaneously cannot get through an amendment that protects women in prison, in single-sex prison spaces, and that amendment cannot be brought through. Lord Blencathra has tried to bring that to the House of Lords twice now, and he's had to withdraw it because, you know, politicians overwhelmingly looked like they were going to defeat it. And I hope he brings another amendment back. But you've got women who cannot speak up for themselves in prison with male rapists, and these assaults are happening. Yeah. So I just think this is, like you say, it's a trinket. It's a little bit of polish over the top of offering us virtually nothing in the way of improving women's rights, and they are getting worse.
Well, there we go. I want to know your views on this. Do email me thoughtfully, conscientiously, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us @gbnews, and I'll get the idea of what you, the nation, really thinks on this. You're with Alex Phillips on GB News, on DAB as well, of course. Now time for another of today's top stories. Officers from Hampshire Police have arrested a 21-year-old man in Basingstoke after missing Marnie Clayton was found safe. Miss Clayton from Bracknell, who is 18, was reported missing in the early hours of Sunday morning after a night out at a nightclub. The suspect remains in police custody. Well, let's cross to our GB News London reporter, Alice Porter, who is live in Windsor. And Alice, Marnie Clayton had been on a night out when she went missing.
Yeah, that's right. Hi there, good afternoon. She was just at the Attic nightclub behind me on William Street. So it's a relatively busy sort of street in Windsor. You can see there's a couple of other sort of pubs along here, and it was just a sort of normal Saturday night out with her friends. And what we do know is that she left the club at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock on Sunday morning, but didn't make it home. And just before 3 o'clock in the morning, her parents contacted the police and said she was missing, and said this was completely out of character. Now, Thames Valley Police, they then conducted quite an extensive of operation to try and find her over Sunday and into Monday, and there was a lot of support from the public. I mean, interestingly enough, the nightclub behind me, Attic, they provided a lot of CCTV material of the night, and also many members of the public shared on social media concerns about where she was. And she was found yesterday in Basingstoke, which is about 30 miles here from Windsor. She doesn't live there, she lives in Bracknell. She was found 30 miles from Windsor yesterday afternoon by police, and of course her parents and family are overjoyed to have her back safely with them.
Alice, what do we actually know about the man who's been arrested?
I think this is what is so concerning. I mean, unfortunately, there are lots of issues with missing people all the time, and most often they are reunited with their families within 48 hours. But to have somebody arrested in this way on some quite serious offences is really alarming. These are the offences that he is being arrested on suspicion of, and they are battery, assault, breach of police bail, making threats to kill, and most significantly of all, a false imprisonment. So this is a 21-year-old from Reading who has been arrested on suspicion of these 5 offences.
I mean, yet again, it's another story of something happening to a woman in the papers. I mean, this raises important questions about women's safety, doesn't it? Well, there we are. Yet again, another story where... So I think we've had don't know what was going on there. All sorts of things going on in my ears. Well, you're with GB News on TV and radio. Time for a short break now and a check on the weather forecast.
Hello again. Another dry day for the vast majority today. A mixture of cloud, sunshine, with some places staying misty with fog, and it's not dry everywhere. We do have some rain across Northern Ireland and Western Scotland, courtesy of this weather front. But it's bumping up against an area of high pressure, so it will be weakening as it crosses into Western Scotland. But it's bringing some wet weather through the morning and into the early afternoon across Northern Ireland for sure, and it will turn damp in Western Scotland during the afternoon. Elsewhere, most places dry, plenty of sunshine over northern England, parts of North Wales, East Anglia too, but there is patchy cloud across the south, and some places not really getting rid of the overnight fog, staying quite misty and murky, and if that happens, temperatures are really going to struggle. But with some sunshine, we should see temperatures generally close to average, 7 to maybe 10 Celsius. We'll see a bit more of that patchy rain just crossing through the central belt of Scotland this evening, and then it stays fairly wet over the Highlands, Western Isles and the Northern Isles overnight. Some patchy rain, perhaps at times drifting into northern England, and things turn damp later in the night through the early hours across Northern Ireland. It'll be a milder night, particularly so across the north, but even further south you could see some patchy fog and maybe a little bit of frost in rural areas, but generally temperatures holding up. More cloud then on Wednesday, certainly for northern England initially, and across the Midlands and Wales, a bit of rain early in the morning. That moves southwards and it'll bring the odd spot of rain across East Anglia and the southeast. As that clears through, brighter but colder weather will arrive, but temperatures through the day should still, at least for a time, get up to double figures across the south. But colder air is arriving in the far north. Some wintry showers likely over the Northern Isles and the northeast of the mainland. Could turn icy here on Wednesday night as temperatures start to plummet, and we will keep clear skies for many, so that will allow those temperatures to fall for Thursday morning. A cold day then on Thursday. Some snow showers across parts of eastern England are possible, but for most a dry and a bright day, turning cloudier but staying on the cold side into the weekend.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. Now it's time for the section of the show where we, of course, doff our fascinators to the imagined matriarchy as we go about building our very own Womanifesto. All my guests get to nominate 3 policies they think would make the world a better place. And, of course, as High Empress of the show, I'll decide if they make the cut. So, Jean, you're slightly empowered by the fact we may be crossing live to Nicola Sturgeon soon for an announcement, but let's crack on anyway. What is your first offering for the Womanifesto?
I haven't necessarily got them in order of importance, but I think it's absolutely essential, just like all of the women in the decades before me, that we abolish porn and prostitution as 2 of the sort of, foundations of oppression of women. And I think that, in an ideal world, if we could redistribute all the profits that were still retained when those things were abolished and redistribute them amongst the women who were exploited within those 2 spaces.
I love it. Now, do you know what? Very unceremoniously, we've got to interrupt and cross over to Nicola Sturgeon, but we'll pick this up very shortly. Let's go over to Holyrood.
1 fewer than yesterday. 59 people are currently in intensive care, including 17 who have been in ICU for more than 28 days, and that's 1 more than yesterday. Sadly, though, a further 31 deaths have been reported, which takes the total number of deaths under the daily definition to 10,093. And once again, I send my condolences to everyone who is mourning a loved one. As we can see from the data, Omicron is continuing to infect large numbers of people here in Scotland, across the UK and indeed in many other countries around the world. Hospital admissions and overall hospital occupancy associated with COVID also remain high. However,
sure we get the response right while doing it as quickly as possible. So I can assure her that work is...
I set out last week, suggesting that the situation was beginning to improve, has significantly strengthened over the past 7 days. A combination of booster vaccinations, the willingness of the public to adapt their behaviour to help stem transmission and the temporary protective measures introduced in December has helped blunt the impact of the Omicron wave. Last week I said that the data indicated cases were falling across most age groups, and I can report today that this trend has continued. Now, there still needs to be some caution applied in interpreting case data at this stage, given the recent changes to guidance on PCR and lateral flow testing. However, data for the past 13 days, taking account of both PCR and lateral flow tests, shows a significant fall in the number of new positive cases. And to put some detail on that, on Sunday, Monday and Tuesday of last week, 36,526 new positive cases were recorded through PCR and lateral flow tests. This week, over Sunday, Monday and today, Tuesday, 20,268 cases have been reported, so quite a significant drop. And if we look just at PCR tests, although I would ask everybody to bear in mind the limitations now in doing so, we have seen cases fall from an average of almost 13,000 a day to just over 4,600. That's a decline of 64%, and cases have fallen across all age groups. Test positivity in PCR tests has also declined from almost 30% in early January to under 20% now. The most recent Office of National Statistics data, which covers the week to the 7th of January, and so it does have a time lag associated with it, reinforces this more stable and positive assessment. It indicated that the number of people with COVID in that week, around 1 in 20, was broadly the same as in the previous week. So taking all of this into account and triangulating the various sources of data allows us to say with some confidence that the rise in cases driven by Omicron peaked in the first week of January and that we are now on the downward slope of this wave of cases. This assessment is also reflected in the data on hospital admissions, hospital occupancy. The number of patients in hospital at any given time with COVID is higher than it was 7 days ago, increasing from 1,479 to 1,546 today. However, the increase of 67 is significantly smaller than it was in the previous 7 days. And encouragingly, admissions to hospital of people with COVID, though still too high, are nevertheless now actually falling. In the week to 7th January, 1,040 were admitted. In the week to 14th January, that was down to 960. The number of people in ICU, which this time last week was rising, has also now fallen slightly over the past 7 days, from 65 to 59. So all of this is very positive news, and it comes as an enormous relief, I am sure, to all of us. Of course, we do need to recognise that there are still some uncertainties ahead, and so throwing all caution to the wind at this stage would be a mistake. For example, the full impact of the return to work and school after the festive break won't be apparent yet in the data, so it is possible that we will see case numbers tick up again in the next couple of weeks. Also, just as the introduction of some protective measures may have helped slow down transmission, it stands to reason that the lifting of these measures could have the opposite effect. Indeed, that is exactly why it makes sense to lift measures on a phased basis. And lastly, although cases are now falling, the NHS remains under acute pressure, and staff absences are still causing some disruption across the economy and our critical services. So while we can take great heart from the latest data, we know from experience how important it is to be responsible and appropriately cautious in the face of this virus. And that is the context then for the decisions that Cabinet reached this morning. Yesterday, of course, the limit on attendances at outdoor public events was lifted. The remaining statutory measures introduced in response to Omicron are as follows: limits on attendance at indoor public events, the requirement for 1 metre physical distancing between different groups in indoor public places, the requirement for table service in hospitality premises serving alcohol on the premises, and the closure of nightclubs. Given the improving situation, and as I said last week, we hoped to be able to do, I can confirm today that all of these measures will be lifted from next Monday, 24th January. We will also, from Monday, remove the guidance advising adults against non-professional indoor contact sports so that these can resume as normal. And from Monday, we will also lift the guidance asking people to stick to a 3-household limit on indoor gatherings. However, it is important, I think, to stress this point. Notwithstanding the improving situation, the level of COVID infection circulating in the community is still high. So to minimise the risk of getting the virus, it would be sensible for all of us to remain cautious in our social interactions at this stage. Even though from Monday we will no longer recommend a fixed upper limit on numbers of households, if we all continue to keep gatherings as small as our circumstances allow for now, I would suggest until the end of this month, we will reduce our chances of getting infected. And of course, we should continue to take lateral flow tests before meeting up with people from other households. Please also remember to record test results, whether positive or negative, through the UK Government website. Let me stress this is even more important now that we are no longer advising confirmatory PCR tests for those without symptoms who test positive through lateral flow devices. Recording these results ensures that we are able to make better assessments of the trends in infection. Finally, Presiding Officer, we will continue to ask people to work from home whenever possible at this stage and for employers to facilitate this. However, we will engage with business now about a return to a more hybrid approach from the start of February. The baseline mitigation measures that were in place before Omicron and the requirement for businesses, service providers and places of worship to take reasonable measures to minimise the spread of COVID on their premises will be retained at this stage to help keep COVID contained as this wave recedes. That means face coverings should still be worn, must still be worn in public indoor settings and on public transport. Businesses and other organisations should continue to have regard to guidance and take reasonable steps to minimise the spread of COVID. And hospitality premises should continue to collect contact details for customers, which is, of course, important for the effective operation of Test and Protect. In addition, the COVID certification scheme will continue to apply for now to large indoor and outdoor events and to late-night venues, all settings where transmission risks can be higher. As of yesterday, guidance stipulates that organisers of events with 1,000 or more in attendance should check the certification status of at least 50% of attendees or 1,000 people, whichever is higher. Now, I indicated last week the Cabinet would consider and decide today whether or not to extend the certification scheme to other premises, such as licensed hospitality venues. This was undoubtedly the most difficult decision we faced this morning, and yet again the judgment we have arrived at was finely balanced. On the one hand, extending COVID certification could offer public health benefits, ensuring that people attending certain venues are vaccinated or tested. It reduces to some extent the risks of transmission and also the risk of serious illness should an individual contract the virus in one of these settings. On the other hand, we understand that extending certification could create additional costs for businesses at an already very challenging time, and of course the smaller the business, the more difficult these costs can be to bear. So the task for Cabinet today was to weigh these considerations and decide what, in the current circumstances, would be proportionate. Given that cases are now falling quite rapidly and the current wave is receding, we decided that we will not, at this stage, extend the COVID certification scheme to other premises. We will, of course, reconsider this should circumstances and therefore the balance of judgment change in any significant way. If cases were to start to rise very sharply again, extension of certification may well be a more proportionate alternative to other more restrictive measures. However, our conclusion today, given the improving situation, is that extending certification would not be proportionate at this stage. There is, though, one reasonably minor change to the certification regulations that we will propose. At the moment, nightclubs and other late-night venues must apply the scheme if they have in use a designated area for dancing. We intend to amend the definition here to provide greater clarity and prevent premises from avoiding certification simply by having tables on a dance floor and therefore claiming it's not a dance floor but nevertheless permitting dancing to take place. This change will take effect from Monday when late-night venues are able to reopen. Finally, Presiding Officer, let me say a few words about the updated rules on self-isolation after a positive COVID test. These rules, confirmed 2 weeks ago, remain in place. If you test positive, you will be advised to self-isolate for 10 days. However, if you don't have a fever and you take 2 negative lateral flow tests more than 24 hours apart on day 6 and day 7, you can end self-isolation on day 7. Last week, the UK Government announced further changes to self-isolation for England. This was publicised as allowing people to end self-isolation after day 5. Essentially, however, this change simply brings England's rules into line with those already in force in Scotland. This is because in Scotland we count the day of a positive test as day 1 of isolation. In England, this is counted as day 0. In addition, in England you can end self-isolation after day 5. In Scotland, you can end it on day 7. So the slightly different ways of defining the beginning and the end of the self-isolation period has given the impression of difference. But the substance, the period people are actually required to self-isolate for, is in fact the same in Scotland and in England. And I think it's important that people are clear about that. Presiding Officer, the lifting from Monday of the protections introduced in response to Omicron is possible in part because of the efforts everyone has made voluntarily and as a result of guidance and statutory measures to help stem transmission. And I want to put on record again today my thanks to people across the country. But it is also, of course, down to the success of vaccines. At this stage of the vaccination programme, we continue to offer boosters and also to implement the latest advice from the JCVI. Just before Christmas, the JCVI recommended that booster jags should be offered to 16 and 17-year-olds 12 weeks after their second jags. So any 16 or 17-year-old who had a second jag 12 weeks or more ago, or who is just approaching that point, can now book a booster appointment online through NHS Inform. They can also turn up at a drop-in centre and get a booster there. In addition, second doses of the vaccine are now available for 12 to 15-year-olds who had a first dose at least 12 weeks previously. Again, appointments can be booked online. Alternatively, young people can choose to go to a drop-in centre, and parents and carers are, of course, welcome to attend with them. So far, the JCVI has recommended that booster jags should be offered only to those 12 to 15-year-olds at particular clinical risk from COVID. Any 12 to 15-year-old in that position will receive a letter inviting them for a booster 12 weeks after their last primary dose. There is no need to book an appointment. And finally, 5 to 11-year-olds with specific medical conditions that put them at greater risk from COVID will be invited for their first vaccination from this week onwards. Again, let me stress, they will be contacted directly. There is no need for them, or more appropriately, their parents or carers, to book online. In due course, 5 to 11-year-olds who are household contacts of people with immune suppression will also be invited to receive vaccination. And of course, we stand ready to quickly implement any updated advice from the JCVI about vaccinating all 5 to 11-year-olds. There are good reasons why the JCVI has given different advice for different age groups, but I realise it can be confusing. So the NHS Inform website now has a self-help guide for parents, carers and children, setting out what young people need to do to get vaccinated and when they can do it. If you can't get online, you can also get this information by phoning the vaccination hotline on 0800 030 8013. That's 0800 030 8013. Now, the final point I want to make relates to vaccinations for adults. Scotland has achieved very high rates of vaccination. We are the most vaccinated part of the UK in terms of first, second, third and booster doses. But there are still more than 600,000 people over the age of 18 who are eligible for a booster but haven't yet had it. And there are hundreds of thousands more who have not yet had a first or second dose. So I would encourage anyone who falls into one of these categories to make an appointment as soon as possible or go to a drop-in clinic. There is plenty of capacity and you will be made welcome.
That's Nicola Sturgeon there, addressing Scotland from Holyrood, talking about restrictions on indoor events ending on the 24th of January, of course, right in time for Burns Night. Nightclubs will reopen. It's the end of table service only at pubs, and the 3 household limit on indoor gatherings also being scrapped. You're with GB News on TV and DAB radio. After the break, it's time for my guests to have their say. We'll hear what Jean Hatchett needs to talk about. I'll see you shortly.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. Well, let's go now to one of the main stories of the day. And following the Partygate row engulfing the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has apologised again for the mistakes that may have been made. Here's what he had to say earlier while he was visiting Finchley Memorial Hospital in North London.
I want to begin by repeating my apologies to everybody for the misjudgments that I've made, that we may have made in Number 10 and beyond, whether in Downing Street or throughout the pandemic. And I do know how infuriating it must be for people up and down the country in view of the huge sacrifices that people have made, the way that they've kept discipline, the way they've followed the rules, followed the guidance, done the right thing, to think that that didn't happen in Number 10 Downing Street. So I want to just say to you on that point, no, nobody told me that what we were doing was, as you say, against the rules, that the event in question was something that we were going to do something that wasn't a work event. And, as I said in the House of Commons, when I went out into that garden, I thought that I was attending a work event. I think it's very important that we see what Sue Gray, see what the inquiry has to say. I will be coming back to the House of Commons as soon as it's reported, or as soon as I can after it's reported, and I'll be telling people more.
Okay, just to be clear then, you're saying that Dominic Cummings is lying and his version of events is not true.
I just repeat, I'm deeply sorry for mistakes that were made.
Are you saying that he's lying and his version of events? It's very important. Viewers will want to know, the public will want to know, MPs will want to know.
Of course.
He's on the record saying under oath, you are lying, that you were warned about this event and you went ahead anyway, that you knew.
I can tell you categorically that nobody told me and nobody said that this was something that was against the rules, that was a breach of the COVID rules, or we were doing something that wasn't a work event, because frankly I don't think, I can't imagine why on earth it would have gone ahead or why it would have been allowed to go ahead. My memory of this event, as I've said, is going out into the garden for about 25 minutes for what I implicitly thought was a work event, and talking to staff, thanking staff. I can't remember exactly how many, but for about 25 minutes I was there. I then went back to my office and continued my work. I do humbly apologise to people for misjudgments that were made, but that is the very, very best of my recollection about this event. That's what I've said to the inquiry. We'll have to see what they say.
Well, a very downbeaten-looking Boris Johnson there, justifying his arguments when it comes to the supposed party at Downing Street, one of many parties currently under investigation in that inquiry by Sue Gray. Well, it's time now for my esteemed guests to unburden themselves and tell me what they need to talk about. Jean, sorry to bring you all the way down here. We've barely had time to speak, so come on, what is it that you want to get off your chest?
I think, over the last week, the issue of single-sex prisons has been dominating lots of discussions with women. I think it's so vital that we discuss it when those women themselves can't, except for, of course, the very, very brave woman at the weekend who came forward with her story about actually being sexually assaulted in a female prison by a male who identified as a female. And I found her story absolutely terrifying, because we're being told, well, no, not all trans women are sexual offenders, but the point is that some of them are. And we had, between 2016 and 19, there were 34 trans women in female jails without a GRC. We don't actually know how many are with a GRC, a gender recognition certificate. So these are self-identified men who say they are women. And
so these could be rapists, they could be paedophiles, they could be sexual abusers, they could have committed violent crimes against women, and they say, oh, by the way, now I'm a woman, and they get put in a female prison.
Yeah, absolutely. And women don't have to pretend that that's not happening in order to be kind. And it's okay to say that some of those prisoners will assault women, and those women deserve better. And we have to speak up for those women. And, I was really proud of James Treadwell, Professor James Treadwell, Staffordshire University, spoke up on this issue. And so few people who should be speaking up, criminologists and politicians, etc., they're just dodging this issue. Yeah. And they're failing those women behind bars who are not safe. And, OK, what if it was just the one prisoner that that's one too many.
Just one too many.
That risk is too high.
Yeah.
So this is not about saying all trans prisoners are inherently violent, but it's saying that some are, and we don't have to look the other way.
Well, some are arguably not even trans, they're just self-identifying. It has, of course, been a very contentious topic online, and so we're going to delve a little bit deeper into this. Also joining us in this discussion is the Diversity and Inclusion Facilitator, Katie John Went, who is transgender. Katie, what's your position on this? Do you think it should be the case that a male criminal, a convicted criminal, can just say, well, look, now I identify as a woman and be put into a female-only prison? Or do you think there's an inherent risk with that, with it being that simple?
Well, the thing is, it isn't that simple. And if it were that simple, even people outside of prison would be saying, why can't I have it as easy as the people in prison? Outside of prison, you have to go through many, many hoops. You have to self-ID for 2 years before you even get into the system. So the system outside of prison takes many years. Once in a prison, someone who suddenly then says, oh, I am now trans, yes, I think it's fair to take that down the full risk assessment path and to have some suspicion, one might say, of it. But the thing is, though, we had this debate in part last week as well with the Gender Recognition Act. The Gender Recognition Act, because it exists, does require them to initially place people in the prison according to their birth sex or GRC, which actually creates a fresh birth certificate. So that is something the prisons are obliged to consider placing someone in that sex-assigned place. But then the next thing they're obliged to do is risk assessment. And this is where it seems to be failing consistently in too many cases. I mean, there's something like over half of the trans people in prison have a criminal, violent or sexual violent history. The numbers that are in women's prisons, the numbers with a sex and violence history, is reduced compared to that. So clearly some risk assessment has happened because they haven't transferred most of the ones with the violent history. But as far as I'm concerned, I do understand completely the position of women here that to some extent, nobody should be in the prison who has a sexual and violent history against women. I mean, I imagine most women wouldn't want to be sharing a prison with Myra Hindley either. It's not to say that sex and violence and abuse can't happen only in male-born people. But people should be protected, full stop. It is part of the human rights that still exist for all prisoners. Even a paedophile has human rights and is meant to be protected from the general population of any prison. But equally, the rest of the population is meant to be protected from them.
I'm going to bring Jean back into this. I mean, you've heard what Katie has to say. I mean, she's made some extremely valid points there. But do you think that it's good enough to say, let's do this on a case-by-case basis? Or does this essentially sort of crack the door open an inch for it to be flung open and have the whole system overturned?
For me, I think, the sort of discussion there is around the very, very, very pressing need to clarify these single-sex exemptions that are in the Equality Act and the way that they stack up against this Gender Recognition Act that's being, that Katie's talking about. Because you have a specific exemption in the Equality Act at Schedule 3, Part 7, that allows for some exemptions for women to have single-sex space. And nowhere should that be more applicable than in prison, when the most vulnerable women, and actually the most vulnerable women who are women, are incarcerated after largely petty crimes. So you've got 82% of women are in for, things like shoplifting, sometimes to fund the drug use of others. You've got the poorest women in there. You've got a high percentage of BAME women there. These women, from my point of view, really shouldn't be there in the first place. Those are petty crimes as a result of poverty and debt, but they are. And so those women have often also experienced domestic or sexual violence. I don't believe that those women should be asked to be kind to men who and their feelings, and to accommodate that, because I do think it's about validity, because a third space is possible. I can't see what the objections to that are, other than it might be far from family or it's not inclusive. Well, I'm actually not that bothered. I care about female people. I care about those women. And I really, really want to see government tackle that specific part of the Equality Act, strengthen it, use it, and keep those women safe.
Jean, Katie, thank you ever so much. I mean, it's a contentious issue. I don't think it's going anywhere. We'll be discussing it for many more weeks to come, I'm sure. Now, lots of you have been sending in your views on the subject we've been covering today. And Wendy says, what about violence against men? My son was assaulted by a woman, and she was only convicted of assault because I was lucky enough to have it all on CCTV. Look, no one says that violence against men doesn't happen. In fact, I think men tend to be not only the largest perpetrators, but the victims. But let's not muddy the water, because we are looking at particularly misogyny as a hate crime. Charles says, totally in favour of any law that protects women's rights. Any party or organisation that would suggest that other rights should be considered ahead of the protection of women is wrong. I completely agree with that. If only that were how it was in reality. Derek says, I wouldn't expect Parliament to be any help on women's rights. I feel like women's rights have been forgotten. You and me both, Derek. Well, nowadays, it's hard to know, isn't it, what's offensive and what isn't. Well, it isn't hard, because everything's offensive, right? A joke that makes one person laugh out loud might send another into their safe space. Well, here on We Need to Talk About, we're not shy. We aim to find out what we really think is unacceptable. The wolf whistles get your goat. Is holding the door open cringe? Do we really want to split the bill? It's the time of day that we reveal the daily trigger warning. Jane, I love this bit of the show. What is it that you want to banish to the dustbin of history? What really gets your goat and sets you aflame?
The phrase isolated incident. I think that one really, really needs to go in the bin. The media use it repeatedly when discussing women who've been murdered, specifically in the context of domestic abuse, that it was an isolated incident. It only happened a little bit. In this community, it doesn't normally happen. It's not an isolated incident. We know that a woman is murdered every 3 days by a man and every 4 days by a man she knew. So, this is not in any way isolated, and all of those incidents do link up. So, there's no isolation. But we keep seeing this phrase used, and it must go from the media. They must get to grips with it.
Does it sort of, to you, reflect this idea that we are constantly whitewashing what is, to women who are looking at this, a very clear exponential trend in the sort of way women are being treated in the 21st century? Things that probably were unthinkable. It's not that violence against women was invented yesterday, but the sort of different types of offences against women. Do you think that this sort of whitewashes the fact that there is this growing trend, and it's putting women in a very vulnerable position?
Yeah, I think, we have had 139 women were murdered by men last year, that we know of. And thank you to Karen Ingala-Smith, as always, for counting those women. We also hear as well, men are just kept from the headline. So you get murder arrested. Now, if we could arrest murder, that would be fantastic, because there would be no murder. We could stick murder behind bars and it would all be done. But man is taken out of the headline, and actually that's a much shorter word than the murder. Man arrested for the murder of a woman. So, I really wish, and it is, I've got to say, the people that I pick up the most for this are the BBC. They arrest murder all the time on the BBC, and yet we still have women murdered every week.
That gets me riled up because it's just rubbish grammar more than anything. Now, we were speaking a little bit earlier, weren't we, about the way society has changed. I want to just go back to that very briefly because I think it's a very important point that you wanted to raise. So extremely briefly, it is about this sort of extreme hardcore porn that we're getting in society now that is imperiling women and creating a sort of derangement societally, which is making it very tough, especially for young girls.
I think now that there is such an easy access to porn for young people from a very young age, how can we expect that young boys are going to grow into their adult relationships with a respect for women when they are seeing the vast majority of what they're expected to do sexually is performed in this very, very violent way. Women raped on camera in the most brutal ways. And, you know, to me, that is rape because I think those women have been exploited.
It's rape with cameras.
And so, you know, we've got these things underpinning how men grow, how they becoming role model to each other. And, you know, the normalisation of violence against women is in both porn and prostitution. That's why I suggested the abolition of both.
Jean, it's been wonderful having you on the programme today. Thank you ever so much for joining me. That's all we've got time for, but join me again tomorrow for We Need to Talk About on GB News. Same time, same place, 2 o'clock. Coming up next, it's The Briefing with Darren McCaffrey, but first, it's time for the weather forecast.
Hello again. Another dry day for the vast majority today. A mixture of cloud, sunshine, with some places staying misty with fog, and it's not dry everywhere. We do have some rain across Northern Ireland and Western Scotland, courtesy of this weather front. But it's bumping up against an area of high pressure, so it will be weakening as it crosses into Western Scotland. But it's bringing some wet weather through the morning and into the early afternoon across Northern Ireland for sure, and it will turn damp in Western Scotland during the afternoon. Elsewhere, most places dry, plenty of sunshine over northern England, parts of North Wales, East Anglia too, but there is patchy cloud across the south and some places not really getting rid of the overnight fog, staying quite misty and murky, and if that happens, temperatures are really going to struggle, but with some sunshine, we should see temperatures generally close to average, 7 to maybe 10 Celsius. We'll see a bit more of that patchy rain just crossing through the central belt of Scotland this evening, and then it stays fairly wet over the Highlands, Western Isles and the Northern Isles overnight. Some patchy rain, perhaps at times drifting into Northern England, and things turn damp later in the night through the early hours across Northern Ireland. It'll be a milder night, particularly so across the north, but even further south, you could see some patchy fog and maybe a little bit of frost in rural areas, but generally temperatures holding up. More cloud then on Wednesday, certainly for Northern England initially and across the Midlands and Wales, a bit of rain early in the morning. That moves southwards and it'll bring the odd spot of rain across East Anglia and the southeast. As that clears through, brighter but colder weather will arrive, but temperatures through the day should still, at least for a time, get up to double figures across the south. But colder air is arriving in the far north. Some wintry showers likely over the Northern Isles and the northeast of the mainland. Could turn icy here on Wednesday night as temperatures start to plummet, and we will keep clear skies for many, so that will allow those temperatures to fall for Thursday morning. A cold day then on Thursday. Some snow showers across parts of eastern England are possible, but for most a dry and a bright day, turning cloudier but staying on the cold side into the weekend.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retune